He pulled out a gun. No warning, no reason. A black woman was dragged from her car and thrown to the ground in the middle of the street, with the crowd watching indifferently and the radio crackling in the police car. No one intervened. No one asked questions. Because to them, the color of her skin was a verdict. Her name was Layla Monroe. She had no criminal record. She was not carrying a weapon. She did not run a red light. All she did wrong was be a black woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. In a city where the police did not need evidence, only power and prejudice, and they thought it would be just another forgotten arrest. But they did not expect it to spark a chain of underground resistance, because a lawyer named Vivian Cross had entered the fray. And this time the system would pay the price. A trial that revealed a conspiracy, an investigation that shook up the political scene, and an ending no one could have expected. Subscribe to the channel now to discover the whole truth hidden behind the so-called justice. The Franklin County Courthouse, a gray stone building on the city's south side, has long been a place of convictions, oaths, and people walking out with changed fates. But today, in Courtroom 3, a seemingly ordinary courtroom harbored something unusual, a silence that was stretched taut like a broken string, ready to explode. On the defendant's bench, a young woman, Layla Monroe, sat silently, her hands clasped together, as if that was the only thing she could hold on to. The light from the large windows illuminated her face, a face that was both innocent and desperate. 24 years old. Brown skin, brown eyes. And no one was out there fighting for her, except for one person, who had yet to enter the courtroom. The room was strangely quiet. A murmur of malice came from the back rows. Some looked at Layla, as if they knew the verdict before the judge opened his mouth. One even had a story ready for the local news. Black girl arrested for robbing convenience store. The evidence is clear. Clear evidence? There were no cameras. No fingerprints. No DNA. Only one witness, a white male clerk, had identified Layla as the woman who had held him at gunpoint that night. "I can't forget that face," he had said during the identification. Even though Layla was the only one in the long line of suspects wearing a white shirt, the killer was described as wearing black. The incongruity wasn't in the details, it was in the default belief. A black woman could always be the culprit, even without evidence. Up on the dais, Judge Judith Hale had not yet appeared, but everyone in the courtroom felt her invisible presence. Judith, the woman the entire legal profession in this city both respected and feared. In nearly 3 decades on the bench, she had never lost. Every time a person of color entered a courtroom, she almost didn't need a debate. She had already made up her mind. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew it. Layla knew it too, and that was what made her eyes, even though there were no tears, still filled with rage. An indignation that could not be expressed in words, could not be pounded on the table in protest, could not be screamed at. Because in this room, every sound she made would only be considered opposition, disrespect, or worse, deliberately causing trouble. All she could do was remain silent. But it wasn't resignation. It was a fire burning, waiting for the right person to ignite it. And then, the courtroom door opened. No one stood up. Not because they didn't respect the person who entered, but they were too familiar with that image to be surprised. Vivian Cross, defense attorney. The woman in the black suit, her hair neatly tied, her eyes cold, and her steps silent. At 42 years old, Vivian did not need to prove herself. This city had seen cases that seemed impossible to win. Then she peeled them apart, piece by piece, like peeling off layers of lies. But this time, her opponent was not an ambitious prosecutor or a lying policeman. This time, she would have to confront the whole system, with a person sitting at the highest podium who ruled this courtroom like an invisible god. Vivian put her leather briefcase down on the defense table. She did not rush to open it. She looked around quietly, glancing at the contemptuous eyes of the prosecution, pausing for a moment on the jury, noticing the very slight nod of a middle-aged man, not in agreement, but in curiosity. Then finally her eyes met Layla, that young girl, the one the whole system was trying to crush, did not laugh, did not cry, but that gaze contained a silent sky that was about to break. Vivian understood immediately. This was not an ordinary trial. This was a place where, if she failed, not only Layla would be convicted, but all those like her would have their faith extinguished forever. The gavel rang out. Judith Hale entered. Her appearance was solemn, her silver hair neat. Her glasses could not hide her cold eyes like knives. She needed no introduction. She only said one sentence. "We can begin." Everyone sat down. Vivian remained standing. Her eyes did not blink, looking straight at the judge. And for the first time in her life, Judith Hale paused, just for a millisecond, before adjusting her glasses and saying sarcastically, "Miss Cross, I hope you're not wasting my time today." Vivian replied softly, without a trace of sarcasm. "I hope so, Judge. But I believe there are things worth more than time, like justice." The air in the courtroom trembled slightly. Behind her, Layla sat silently. But for the first time since her arrest, the corners of her lips lifted slightly. A smile? Small, but the first sign that she had been heard. And that was how the trial really began. The gavel echoed a second time. But this time, the sound was not of order, but of a war horn. The game had begun, not between the defense and the prosecution, but between one man and the system. Vivian Cross, still standing at the defense table, her eyes like the surface of a cold lake, calm but bottomless. She had entered this familiar space hundreds of times in her career, but each time it was the same feeling. Judged not for her ability to argue, but for her skin color, her gender, and for daring to be there. Across the courtroom, the lead prosecutor, Bradley Keene, was lifting a paper cup of coffee, drinking it with a smirk on his lips, as if he were used to crafting a verdict. He was 34 years old, fair-skinned, neat, and full of the confidence of someone who always had the court on his side. Not because he was good, because he was the kind of man the system was designed to protect. He glanced at Vivian, his gaze filled with sweet contempt. The kind of look men would give to a woman of color who thought a woman of color should be a secretary, not an equal, or worse, an adversary. "Hello, Ms. Cross," Keene said, her voice soft, deliberately laced with sarcasm. "I hope you're prepared. We know this is a sensitive trial." Vivian nodded, not answering right away. She was used to that kind of attack, the kind that didn't involve a knife, but was deep enough to knock a weakling down before the trial even began. But Vivian Cross wasn't that kind of person. She walked to the desk, opening the briefcase with a slow, almost proud movement. Her hand touched the papers, but her gaze remained on Keene, not sharp, but icy, the kind of cold that made it hard to tell whether she was being observed or questioned. "I hope," she said, her voice low and steady as stone, "you're prepared. Because I'm not here to participate in a courtroom drama, I'm here to undo it." The tension in the air seemed to stretch for a moment. Several of the jurors looked at each other. An older man adjusted his collar. A younger woman pressed her hand lightly to her knee, whether to reassure herself or to remind herself to remain neutral. At the podium, Judge Judith Hale said nothing, but her eyes behind her thin glasses followed Vivian, not the gaze of a listener, but of a predator scrutinizing its prey. Only this time, the prey did not flinch. It stared back calmly. Hale tilted her head, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips, as if she had seen hundreds of Vivians over the course of her career, and all of them had disintegrated after a few blows of power. "Miss Cross," she said, "this is a courtroom, not a stage for cinematic dialogue. We are here to judge, not to philosophize." Vivian did not back down. She smiled, a rare smile, but enough to make the room quiet for a beat. "Then I hope justice here is not a pre-written tragicomedy." Keene sat up, clearly unhappy with the pushback. But before he could retort, Hale raised a hand, blocking it, not to protect Vivian, but because she wanted to maintain the initiative. We will begin with the prosecution. And so Keene stepped forward, beginning his presentation like a well-rehearsed piece of music, even voice, eyes on the jury, each word emphasizing emotion, not to seek justice, but to strike fear. He spoke of the threatened community, of victims of trauma, and finally, not forgetting to point to Layla Monroe as if she were a specter of social harm. Layla sat motionless, not looking at Keene, not looking at anyone. But Vivian knew. Each of those slanderous words was a knife to slashing at the girl's self-esteem. When it was her turn, Vivian did not walk up as quickly as she usually did. She walked slowly, as if measuring each step on a stage littered with explosives. But in truth, she was not afraid of the explosives, because she was the one carrying the fire. She stood before the jury. No need to look at the paper, no need to show the slides, just her eyes. I will not convince you with emotional imagery. I will not recreate the scene in 3 dimensions. I do not need to, because the truth, when held in the light, speaks for itself. She turned back to Layla, her eyes determined. Then she turned back to the jury. She may not have been rich. She may not have had power. She may not have had friends in the system. But she had something that the system had promised to protect: innocence. A heavy silence filled the room. On the dais, Judith Hale leaned forward, her chin resting on her hand, seemingly unconcerned, but there was something unnatural in her eyes. The audience, though still silent, no longer saw Layla as a potential criminal. They were beginning to doubt what they had previously taken for granted. Vivian did not need to scream. She did not need to bang on the table. She simply needed to be present. And sometimes, a timely presence is the greatest challenge to false power. The air in the courtroom was no longer pure silence. It was a thin layer of ice, where any noise could break the surface. And in the midst of that tense silence, eyes became weapons. Vivian walked back to the defense table. In a moment when no one seemed to notice, she glanced at Prosecutor Keene. He was leaning back in his chair, casting an enigmatic smile at her. The kind of smile that people who think that, even if they let their opponent speak for a few minutes, the rules of the game are still in their hands. But Vivian didn't look long. She didn't need to. She had faced that look all her life. Ever since she was a 14-year-old girl who followed her mother into the courtroom where her brother had been wrongly convicted on a single testimony by a policeman who couldn't remember the details but was certain the boy was black. Vivian had sworn that if she ever found herself in this position, she would no longer let silence be an option. And now, here she was. Amidst the arrogant, suspicious, and scrutinizing looks, she did not shy away. She let her eyes meet each one. No reaction, no blink, just a silent, creepy presence. A soft voice behind her spoke, not loud enough for others to hear, but enough for Vivian to recognize the venom in each word. They're really letting her argue this case? Vivian did not turn around. She did not care who spoke, because that was not new. And it did not weaken her. In a system where fairness comes not from law but from privilege, contempt sometimes does not need to be shouted. It can be hidden in the look of surprise when a black lawyer walks in. It could be hidden behind polite compliments. She's a good talker, unlike her kind. Vivian had heard that 100 times, and each time she just smiled, the way she was smiling now. Not a smile of connection, but one that made the other person realize, I know what you're thinking, and I don't care. One of the jurors, the middle-aged man from earlier, tilted his head. His gaze became less guarded. He might not have believed Vivian completely, but he was beginning to believe there was something to be heard. And sometimes, a tilt of the head was all that was left between prejudice and change. The brief argument between the two sides was moderated by Judge Hale, who appeared neutral. But Vivian noticed the small details. She didn't interrupt Keene when he got carried away with his victim feelings, but she interrupted Vivian just as she was about to present a contradiction in her testimony. It wasn't surprising. It wasn't angry. Vivian was just taking notes, quietly, as if knitting needles into an armor of truth. She leaned over and whispered to Layla, who had been sitting silently the whole time. When it's your turn, just tell the truth. No more, no less. I'll take care of the rest. Layla looked at her, tears in her eyes for the first time. But not because of fear, but because of hearing those 3 words. I'll take care of it. Care of. In all the days of being arrested, investigated, and charged, no one had ever told her that they would take care of her. Not the police, not the public defender, not the investigating officer. There was only silence, and the way people looked at her like a walking sentence. Vivian's eyes were those of someone who had gone through the darkness and returned to pull someone else out of it. Another gavel knock. The court adjourned for lunch. People filed out of the courtroom. No one said anything to Vivian. No glances of greeting. No friendly nods like the one Keene got from the doorman. But that didn't make her any smaller. She stepped into the hallway, quietly pulling a pen out of her pocket. While she wrote a few notes in her notebook, she listened to the small conversations around her. That cross girl looks cold. I wonder if she's up to something. There are 2 sides to every story, but why does that girl look like a robber? Each word was a small sign, like a compass needle quivering slightly. The direction was changing, not because Vivian screamed, not because she broke the system, but because she made people look back and see that the system was not what they thought it was. The afternoon session began without any climax, but it was the silence that made the atmosphere in the courtroom so ominous. It was like an approaching storm. The sky had not moved, the wind had not picked up, but every premonition warned that something was about to break. Layla Monroe sat in the dock. She had not spoken since morning. She had not cried. She had not shown any emotion. But to Vivian Cross, her defense attorney, it was that silence that cried the loudest. An innocent person did not need to cry. She just needed to be heard. And now, Vivian was about to do it. Judge Judith Hale knocked on the gavel. The prosecution calls its first witness, Mr. Mark Givens. The side door opened. A man entered. A slight figure, his face tired from lack of sleep, his shirt collar pulled up to his chin. Mark Givens, the night shift employee of the convenience store, the only person who claimed to have seen Layla rob the store and take the gun. Everything against Layla started with this man. He stepped up to the witness stand, swearing to tell the truth as required by procedure. But his eyes avoided direct contact, his hand fidgeting with the microphone as if he were trying to cling to something unclear. Prosecutor Bradley Keene stood up, smiling slightly. Mr. Givens, tell the jury. What happened on the night of the incident? Mark took a deep breath. I was on the night shift, as usual. About 9:10, a woman in a hood came in. She had a gun, and she asked me to open the safe. His voice was even, as if reading from a memo, but he was clearly uncertain. And do you recognize the person? Mark nodded after a moment of hesitation. It's her. His eyes pointed to Layla. Layla lowered her head. But Vivian kept her head high. In that brief moment, no one saw the corners of her lips twitch slightly. It wasn't sarcasm. It was that she had heard what she needed to hear. Bradley Keene continued to emphasize. Are you sure? Mark was embarrassed. I think I'm sure. The atmosphere in the courtroom changed. A member of the jury, a middle-aged woman sitting in the middle row, tilted her head. A young man blinked repeatedly. Obviously, the word think was something they didn't expect in such short testimony. Vivian stood up. She walked to the podium, holding a file. Her eyes were cold, but not harsh. Her voice as deep as the surface of a lake in the evening. Mr. Givens, you said, I think it's certain. Does that mean you're not completely sure? Mark was startled. I was panicking, but I think it's the right person. Think? Vivian pressed. Or were you influenced by the circumstances of the identification? Mark glanced at Keene, then back at Vivian. I just picked the person I thought looked the most like. Vivian held up a photo in front of the court. This is the photo of the lineup, right? Yes. Do you see anything strange? Mark was silent. Vivian continued, slowly, as if lifting layers of curtains. There's only one person in white. That's Layla. The rest are in dark. So did you pick her? Because she stood out the most in the lineup? Mark swallowed. I'm Not sure. The jury began to murmur. A member frowned slightly. Someone nodded very slightly, as if they had seen something they had not dared to think about before. Vivian stepped closer, her voice getting lower and lower, but sharper than a knife. Are you sure that you actually saw Layla at the scene? Or were you just led by a vague memory, then guided by the lineup? Mark stammered. I don't want to do anything wrong. Vivian paused, glanced quickly at Judge Hale, as if challenging him. Mr. Givens, were you reminded by anyone from the police or the prosecution that Layla was the prime suspect before you went to identify her? Mark was silent. For a moment, the room seemed to stop breathing. Mr. Givens? Vivian repeated, more clearly this time. Mark looked around. His eyes were red, his palms were damp. I just heard an officer say, "That's her. Just confirm it." Boom. The courtroom almost shook in silence. A blow without shouting, without pounding on the table. Just a piece of truth revealed, and the whole testimony collapsed like a sand castle. Judge Judith Hale rapped the gavel. That's enough, Attorney Cross. The witness has answered. Vivian nodded, slowly turning back to the table. No more words. She didn't need to, because the lie had revealed itself before she could even press charges. At the prosecution table, Bradley Keene looked at Mark as if he were no longer his partner. The mood in the courtroom had changed, from suspicion to shock, and Vivian knew this was only the first step. Layla, who had sat motionless the entire time, turned her head slightly to look at Vivian. A look, not pleading, not begging, but trusting. A look that said, "You hear me," and that was enough for Vivian to keep fighting. The afternoon session began without any climax, but it was the silence that made the atmosphere in the courtroom so ominous. It was like an approaching storm. The sky had not moved, the wind had not picked up, but every premonition warned that something was about to break. Layla Monroe sat in the dock. She had not spoken since morning. She had not cried. She had not shown any emotion. But to Vivian Cross, her defense attorney, it was that silence that cried the loudest. An innocent person did not need to cry. She just needed to be heard. And now Vivian was about to do it. Judge Judith Hale knocked on the gavel. The prosecution calls its first witness, Mr. Mark Givens. The side door opened. A man entered. A slight figure, his face tired from lack of sleep, his shirt collar pulled up to his chin. Mark Givens, the night shift employee of the convenience store, the only person who claimed to have seen Layla rob the store and take the gun. Everything against Layla started with this man. He stepped up to the witness stand, swearing to tell the truth as required by procedure. But his eyes avoided direct contact, his hand fidgeting with the microphone as if he were trying to cling to something unclear. Prosecutor Bradley Keene stood up, smiling slightly. Mr. Givens, tell the jury. What happened on the night of the incident? Mark took a deep breath. I was on the night shift, as usual. About 9:10, a woman in a hood came in. She had a gun, and she asked me to open the safe. His voice was even, as if reading from a memo, but he was clearly uncertain. And, do you recognize the person? Mark nodded after a moment of hesitation. It's her. His eyes pointed to Layla. Layla lowered her head, but Vivian kept her head high. In that brief moment, no one saw the corners of her lips twitch slightly. It wasn't sarcasm. It was that she had heard what she needed to hear. Bradley Keene continued to emphasize. Are you sure? Mark was embarrassed. I think I'm sure. The atmosphere in the courtroom changed. A member of the jury, a middle-aged woman sitting in the middle row, tilted her head. A young man blinked repeatedly. Obviously, the word think was something they didn't expect in such short testimony. Vivian stood up. She walked to the podium, holding a file. Her eyes were cold, but not harsh. Her voice as deep as the surface of a lake in the evening. Mr. Givens, you said, I think it's certain. Does that mean you're not completely sure? Mark was startled. I was panicking, but I think it's the right person. Think? Vivian pressed. Or were you influenced by the circumstances of the identification? Mark glanced at Keene, then back at Vivian. I just picked the person I thought looked the most like. Vivian held up a photo in front of the court. This is the photo of the lineup, right? Yes. Do you see anything strange? Mark was silent. Vivian continued, slowly, as if lifting layers of curtains. There's only one person in white, that's Layla. The rest are in dark. So did you pick her because she stood out the most in the lineup? Mark swallowed. I'm not sure. The jury began to murmur. A member frowned slightly. Someone nodded very slightly, as if they had seen something they had not dared to think about before. Vivian stepped closer, her voice getting lower and lower, but sharper than a knife. Are you sure that you actually saw Layla at the scene? Or were you just led by a vague memory, then guided by the lineup? Mark stammered. I don't want to do anything wrong. Vivian paused, glanced quickly at Judge Hale, as if challenging him. Mr. Givens, were you reminded by anyone from the police or the prosecution that Layla was the prime suspect before you went to identify her? Mark was silent. For a moment, the room seemed to stop breathing. Mr. Givens? Vivian repeated, more clearly this time. Mark looked around. His eyes were red, his palms were damp. I just heard an officer say, that's her. Just confirm it. Boom. The courtroom almost shook in silence, a blow without shouting, without pounding on the table, just a piece of truth revealed. And the whole testimony collapsed like a sand castle. Judge Judith Hale rapped the gavel. That's enough, Attorney Cross. The witness has answered. Vivian nodded, slowly turning back to the table. No more words. She didn't need to, because the lie had revealed itself before she could even press charges. At the prosecution table, Bradley Keene looked at Mark as if he were no longer his partner. The mood in the courtroom had changed, from suspicion to shock. And Vivian knew this was only the first step. Layla, who had sat motionless the entire time, turned her head slightly to look at Vivian. A look, not pleading, not begging, but trusting. A look that said, you hear me? And that was enough for Vivian to keep fighting. As Mark Givens stepped off the witness stand, the room fell into an eerie silence, like an audience leaving a performance where no one knew whether to applaud or walk away. A single testimony, a fulcrum for the entire case, and now that fulcrum was shaking to its core. Vivian sat quietly, flipping through the papers, but her eyes followed the jury. She saw what she expected to see. A wavering gaze, a slight frown, a woman pursed her lips in thought. They were beginning to ask questions, and that was what the system feared most. But then, like a self-protective instinct of power, it reacted. Judge Judith Hale raised her head, her eyes searching Vivian. Attorney Cross, she said, her voice low, but dropping like a stone. The court repeats. This is not the place to make unsubstantiated assumptions about law enforcement without evidence. Vivian was not surprised. She turned, straightened, and her voice was as deep and sharp as a knife in ice. I did not assume, Your Honor. I asked, and the witness answered with his own truth. There was a beat of silence. Then Vivian continued. If the truth makes anyone feel threatened, maybe it's not me. A soundless blow. But Hale knew she had been stabbed, with a blade sharpened by logic, confidence, and shame that people don't dare face. Keene stood up, trying to salvage. The court should note that human memory is imperfect. Just because a witness doesn't use the right words doesn't mean their testimony is unreliable. Vivian didn't turn around. She said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, when a man's freedom is at stake, the word sure should never be the basis of a verdict. A few reporters in this back row began to take notes more quickly. This battle had gone beyond the legal. It was becoming a battle about faith. After the trial, Jefferson Courthouse hallway, Vivian left the courtroom, not heading for the elevators as she usually did. She turned into the west hallway, where the large windows looked out onto the courthouse grounds. She needed a minute to catch her breath. Shoes sounded behind her. She didn't need to turn around, she knew. Keene. That's a smart move, Cross, he said, his voice dropping to a tone of false familiarity. But don't think you can win with a few pointed questions. Vivian didn't answer. She looked out the window, where the sunset was quietly dyeing the grounds red. I don't need to win by twisting, she replied. I just need to make people start doubting things they were sure of. Keene stepped closer, half joking, half threatening. But there are things you shouldn't touch. There are doors that open, not to find the truth, but to destroy those who try to enter. Vivian turned, looking him straight in the eye for the first time. Then we'll see. Who gets destroyed first? Keene smiled faintly and walked away. Alone, Vivian pulled out her phone. On the screen was an unread message from her assistant. Urgent, office broken into. She didn't frown. She gave no expression. But her eyes, which had been golden in the twilight, were now glassy under the winter sky. Something bigger was waiting. The most dangerous people don't break in. They sneak in through the cracks, where you think you're safe. It was just after dark when Vivian Cross returned to her law office. The small street south of downtown Jefferson was a quiet gray. The hum of cars on the avenue was like whispers from a city that was watching her. The 3-story building that housed the office was as quiet as ever. No big sign, no bright lights, just a frosted glass window and an old stone step. But as she stepped onto the steps, Vivian immediately sensed something was wrong. A very specific feeling, like the cold metal tickling her spine. There were no wind chimes as usual. There was no printer next door. And strangest of all, there was no sound, just a heavy silence, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Vivian didn't turn on the lights. She stepped inside, letting the darkness continue to conceal everything, or reveal what needed to be seen. She walked through the reception area, her eyes scanning each object. Everything seemed intact, but that was what made her shiver. There was no sign of forced entry, no drawers pulled out, no mess. The intruder, if there was one, did not want to be discovered. She went up to the 2nd floor, where her private office and safe were kept. Her hand touched the doorknob. It was open. No lock, no jam. The room was neat, but the safe, which held Layla Monroe's case files, was ajar. And inside, it was empty. All the material Vivian had collected herself. The original statements, the camera shots, the lineup diagram, the investigative sketch from an anonymous witness, all gone. Vivian stood in the darkness. No confusion, no anger, just a cold feeling rising from the soles of her feet to her neck. It wasn't the usual fear. It was the feeling of knowing she was being watched. And more than that, the person watching her knew exactly what she was hiding, where she was keeping it, and what password she was using. Her phone vibrated. A text message from an anonymous number, no name saved. "You're on the wrong battlefield. Turn back, if you can." Vivian didn't react immediately. She read the message twice, then deleted it. Didn't reply. Instead, she opened her private security app and sent an emergency alert to 2 contacts, an old colleague in New York, a close friend who had worked in the Federal Internal Affairs Unit. No police, because she knew at this point anyone in the system could be a link. She didn't go home that night. She sat back in her office, lights off, computer on infrared camera, small Glock still held by the side of her chair. She didn't expect the intruder to come back, because she knew he didn't need to. He had taken what he needed. Vivian checked the backup cameras. They were all blank, and then she realized something even more terrifying than the loss of the documents. The time of the theft was about 15 minutes after she had left the office for court the day before. That is, the intruder had been following her schedule. A tingle ran down her spine. The next morning, she returned to the courthouse, still dressed neatly, walking as if nothing had happened. Layla sat in the dock, her face pale but calmer than the first day. When Vivian entered, she nodded very slightly. Vivian said nothing. There was no need to say anything, for there was a silent agreement between men who were being hunted by the same force. They recognized each other by sight, not by words. Prosecutor Bradley Keene looked confident today, but Vivian noticed that his eyes were sleepy. There was a slight uneasiness in the way he held his briefcase, faster than usual, as if he were trying to avoid giving away something. Did he know? Or was he the one who ordered the cover-up? It was impossible to be sure, but Vivian knew. Keene was no longer as sure as he had been. The day's trial passed without much drama, but Vivian sensed something was clearly happening. Someone was playing a bigger game. This was no longer the case of an innocent girl. This was a carefully choreographed drama, where justice was just a layer of paint covering up the rot underneath. That afternoon, When Vivian returned to her office, she received an email. No sender. No IP address traced. Email subject, I can't take it anymore. Brief content. I worked for Judge Hale. There's something you should know. They don't just want Layla convicted. They're paving the way for a political deal. I'll be in touch. No name, no signature, but each line was like a small knife cutting into Vivian's cold resolve. She wasn't afraid of being followed. She wasn't afraid of being broken into. What made her tremble was the truth she still didn't know. For a brief moment, she looked at the new file, a stack of documents about wrongful convictions from more than a decade ago. Some of the names echoed familiarly, like a name attached to every case that had any hint of a problem. Judith Hale. She knew what lay ahead, and knew that if she backed away now, everything would continue as if no one had ever questioned it. But she was not that person. If the enemy came out of the darkness, Vivian would pull the light into the deepest place. When a system is so good at hiding its faults, the only one who can see the truth is the one who has been crushed by it. 3 days had passed since the break-in. The law office was still operating as usual. Vivian was still arriving at court on time, still arguing before the jury with her usual sharpness. But she knew, behind every word, every look, that there was a swirling anger. Not because of the stolen documents, but because a more terrible truth was beginning to emerge. The anonymous email she'd sent her was more than a warning. It was a door. She'd forwarded it to the only person she trusted. Carter Wynn, a former FBI digital surveillance expert who'd helped her on a state corruption case 5 years earlier. When Carter replied, it was a single line. I've got it. Meet me at 10 p.m., same place. The old place was an old radio repair shop in the alley behind Union Station, out of business for nearly 15 years. Vivian arrived on time. No lights, no people, just the sound of wind blowing through rusted metal. She knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. The door was ajar. Inside was darkness and the smell of old motor oil. Carter Wynn was sitting at a wooden table on which were 2 laptops, an external hard drive, and 3 unfinished cups of coffee. Vivian didn't sit down right away. She looked at him, waiting. The email was sent from an encrypted server in Paraguay, but I traced the original. The sender was an administrative assistant. She had worked in Judge Hale's office for more than 6 years. Her name was Harper Ewell. Vivian nodded slightly. Harper quit 2 years ago, suddenly. No reason. But within 3 months, she sold her apartment, changed her phone number, disappeared from social media. She was practically wiped from the system. Vivian was silent. She was taking notes, not reacting. One more thing. Carter flipped open his laptop. A recording appeared on the screen, a little grainy but clear. If she doesn't plead guilty, we'll have to clean it up. I don't want this to drag into next month because the federal funding meeting won't take the risk. Bring in Givens, convince him to remember properly. The voice was indistinct, but at the end of the tape, a familiar female voice rang out, soft but firm. Just do it. I'll handle the rest. A chill ran down Vivian's spine. That voice was Judith Hale's. No need to verify, there was no mistaking it. A judge, a supposed symbol of justice, directed a false testimony. And the reason wasn't justice. It was politics. A federal grant. Some kind of meeting. Vivian turned to Carter. What else? He sighed. It seems Hale wasn't acting alone. I've detected several encrypted calls from her number to a law firm in D.C. that's been implicated in a judicial staffing ring. What's the name? Whitaker and Roth. Vivian nodded, her face expressionless, but her heart burning. Whitaker and Roth was a powerful law firm with connections to judicial nominating commissions, budget review boards, and, according to rumors, an informal network capable of manipulating sensitive judgments. Carter, I need Harper's address. You won't find her easily. Just tell me where to start. Carter slid her a piece of paper. Vivian nodded, standing up. Thanks. Vivian, Carter called after her. Are you sure you want to see this through? People like Hale don't fight by law. They fight by disappearance. Vivian turned her head, half smiling, half serious. Then I'll let them see what happens when someone refuses to disappear. The next morning, she sat alone at the corner coffee shop, holding the file Carter had given her, looking out at the street. In the distance, commuters were still rushing about. Children were still cycling to school. Everything was normal, and that was what made her feel so tight in her chest. Because somewhere in the plush, wood-paneled rooms, amid the handshakes and polite smiles, there are people who are deciding the fate of a generation, and calling it strategic adjustment. Vivian picked up the file, looked at the handwritten name. Harper Ewell, former court assistant, first witness, and maybe the only one brave enough to tell the truth. Harper Ewell had been part of the system. A small cog in the giant machine called the Jeffersonian judiciary. She wasn't powerful. She didn't have a high seat at the courtroom. She didn't have her name on the written verdict. She was just a desk person, working from morning to night, backing up files, typing up transcripts, printing out lines of code like a machine programmed with faith. And that made her the perfect witness. No one paid any attention to her. No one expected her to write down what she heard in Judge Hale's closed office. The phone calls, the unscripted meetings, the outside-the-box talk. But Harper did, and it cost her everything. Vivian found Harper in a small town on the edge of the state, where the phone signal was spotty and the internet was as weak as a dying man's breath. The house she lived in was a single story, with a faded tin roof, a yard overgrown with grass, and windows covered with newspaper. No one in town knew her real name. They called her the old school teacher because she read a lot and never left the house at night. Vivian knocked 3 times. No answer. She didn't leave. She knocked twice more, then took a half-step back. There was a slight movement inside, then silence, and then a woman's voice trembled through the wood. "Who's there?" Vivian didn't shout just enough. "I'm Vivian Cross. I'm here for Layla Monroe, for justice, and for the truth she tried to bury to save herself." A minute passed. The door opened a crack. One eye peered out. Vivian didn't try to enter. She waited. Then Harper opened the door wider and stepped out. She wore an old sweater, her hair tied back, and no makeup. But in her eyes was something Vivian recognized immediately. Someone who had stood at the edge of a precipice and knew how dark it was. They sat in the old kitchen. The yellow light was dim. No TV. No radio. Harper poured water. Her hands shook, but her eyes did not shirk. "I never thought anyone would come looking for me," she said. Vivian nodded. Not to comfort, but to confirm. Yes, they wanted her to forget, and no one had ever intended to give her the chance to speak again. "Why did you send the email?" Harper was silent. She took a sip of water, then said slowly, "Because I have been guilty of silence for too long." Vivian did not interrupt. Sometimes the most precious thing is silence, so that a person can find his voice again. Harper tells of late-night meetings where Judge Hale asked for transcripts to be revised a little to make sense of the trial. Private discussions with prosecutors like Keene. Visits from Whitaker and Roth without going through security. I used to think everyone in the business did, that it was the normal dark side of the business. Vivian clenched her hands under the table. Harper looked at her, her lips pursed. Then there was this girl. No one really cared about her testimony. I read the initial investigation file and it was a mess. I was about to ask, but Hale said to me, "You're here to serve the system, not to judge it." That statement, Harper says, has stuck with her for the past 2 years. I quit after that. I didn't say why. I felt like I was becoming part of the crime. Vivian put her hands on the table and said softly, "And now you're ready to break the silence?" Harper looked her straight in the eyes. For the first time, there was no fear in them. Just exhaustion. "I don't know if my words will change anything, but if I keep silent, I won't be human anymore." Vivian let out a soft breath. Sometimes people don't need a hero, just someone who won't give up their humanity. "I'll protect you, but your testimony must be recorded officially, and soon." Harper nodded. "I will do it. For Layla, for me, and for everyone else who has been trampled by the system." Vivian took out the recorder. They began to record every detail, every piece of old cases, calls, names mentioned. And then one name appeared more often than anyone else. Not Hale, not Keene, Senator Alan Rothwell. Vivian sat up straight. "Are you sure?" Harper nodded. Her face was pale, but her voice did not shake. He was Whitaker and Roth's main contact. He had called Hale directly after cases involving the state budget. Every time a budget was passed quickly, there was at least one test trial to create publicity. Vivian understood. Layla was just a victim in a larger scheme. A pawn, And now she had to step onto the board, where the king had not yet been revealed, but the hand that controlled everything had already begun to leave its mark. The day after Harper officially recorded her testimony, Vivian took the backup to a safe, a personal safe at a small private bank about 30 miles north of Jefferson. No one knew. No secretary. No assistant. No trace on the office system. She had learned from the last break-in. The less information people knew, the more valuable it was to survive. Harper was taken to a secret location with Carter Wynn assisting her. He handled the technical side, the communications, making sure all the data was backed up in 3 places: an offshore cloud server, an offline hard drive, and a manual transmitter. Vivian let out her first breath in days. For now, they had a head start. But when you play chess with someone who doesn't play by the rules, every smart move is punished with a brutal blow. That afternoon, when Vivian returned to her office, the window of her conference room was broken. She stopped right at the threshold, her hand instinctively reaching for the small gun in her bag. But no one was there. No sound. No shadow. Just a piece of paper folded in 3, neatly placed on the black leather chair in the middle of the conference room. No blood, no vandalism, no verbal threats, just a single line handwritten in black ink. Next time we'll send more than just greetings. Beneath the words was a real bullet. Vivian didn't react immediately. She gathered up the paper, picked up the bullet, put it in her gloved pocket, and walked out. She didn't need to call the police. She already knew. The police wouldn't come. Or if they did, they wouldn't do anything. The first blow had been struck, and it wasn't a straight hit. It was a carefully orchestrated, sophisticated, cold warning shot. That night, as Vivian was leaving the parking lot after a meeting with the Freedom Lawyers Organization, a black, unmarked SUV sped past, slamming into the side of her car, sending her spinning 3 times in the middle of the intersection. The glass shattered. The side of the car was torn open. Vivian was unconscious for a few seconds, then woke up in a puff of smoke. She could taste blood in the corner of her mouth, her left hand was bleeding, her right shoulder ached as if it had been dislocated. But she still managed to open the door, crawl out of the car before the SUV came back. It didn't come back, because the blow wasn't meant to kill her. It was meant to remind her, "You're entering our territory, and you're not allowed to survive if you go too far." The police arrived 20 minutes later. They wrote up a report like any other traffic accident. Vivian made no mention of the earlier threat. No mention of Layla, no mention of Hale, no mention of Rothwell. She knew the rules. She made one point. "Yeah, I want to make it clear that the person who hit her did not stop." The officer looked at her with a bored look. "Yes, ma'am?" The driver fled. But without the cameras, it would be very difficult to find. Vivian smiled faintly. She had lived too long to believe that no cameras meant no way to find. In a world where the truth was redesigned, what was lacking was not evidence. It was the will to uncover it. After the accident, Vivian was driven home by Carter. Her shoulder was bandaged, blood was drying on her forehead, her gait was limping. But the gaze was the same. Cold, bright, and piercing, the very essence of the power that was trying to grind her into dust. Carter sat across from her, his coffee cold. "They'll be back," he said. "Next time it could be real." Vivian didn't respond, just asked, "What about Harper?" "Fine. In a safe place. I encrypted everything. But there's a problem." Carter put a printout on the table, a wire transfer code related to a shell company. "Rothwell is moving money out of the country, and I found a contract between the company and a fund that's involved in next year's election campaign." Vivian was speechless. Layla's case, adjusted testimony, state budget, campaign financing. It all wove together like a map of crime woven from the trust people had in the system. "They don't just want to win in court, Vivian," Carter said. "They want to rewrite the rules of the game." Vivian closed her eyes for a moment. The first blow had landed, but it had not broken her. It had only made her understand more clearly. The truth would not be protected by those in authority, but by those who dared to step outside the boundaries of fear. She opened her eyes, smiling slightly. "Then I must strike back, and this time there would be no silence. The truth, in the hands of one person, is only a threat. But when it is shared at the right time, in the right place, it becomes a weapon." Vivian Cross knows that better than anyone. She can't rely on the internal system. The police are blind. The courts are rigged. The traditional press? Mostly controlled by the same interests behind the case. But Vivian has something they don't: the trust of the people, and a story that can't be suppressed by power or money. Her plan of attack begins one ordinary morning. She stands in front of an old red brick building in downtown Jefferson, the headquarters of one of the last independent local news outlets left, Truthline Underground. It's not a big name, it doesn't have a huge budget, but it has what Vivian needs: courage and freedom. She walked in, carrying a USB drive, a copy of Harper's deposition, the original recording of Judith Hale and Prosecutor Keene, and documents from Carter that showed the money trail led to Senator Rothwell. When the station's content manager, Maribel Tran, a Vietnamese-American woman known for exposing petty corruption, opened the file, she said only one thing. "Are you sure you want to release this publicly?" Vivian responded with a look. No hesitation, no fear, just a cold, steely determination. "I don't want it to go viral. I want it to make a splash." 3 days later, Truthline released an exclusive report titled "Fake Justice: Inside the Layla Monroe Trial and the Deep State of Jefferson." The clip ran for more than 25 minutes. It opened with Layla handcuffed in the middle of the courtroom, her eyes bewildered as she heard the indictment. Then came the recording, with Judith Hale's clear voice. "If she just doesn't say anything, this will be quick. I don't want to mess with the budget next month." This was followed by the shaky but firm testimony of Harper Ewell, a living witness. Finally, there was evidence of money transfers between Rothwell's shell company and the legal advocacy group that had funded Hale's election campaign. The report ended with the comment, "The question is no longer, is Layla innocent? It's, how many more people have been silently crushed by the system?" The internet exploded. The hashtag Justice for Layla was trending for 6 hours. Lawyers across the state called for a judicial investigation. Former judges began sharing their stories of being stifled. Law students held panel discussions, and even professors who had been silent began speaking out. The news was shared everywhere, from women of color groups to international human rights organizations. And in the shock, Senator Rothwell's office was swarmed by the press. A spokesperson refused to comment. Judith Hale disappeared. The state court issued a temporary suspension of her pending investigation, and at a quick press conference, Prosecutor Keene appeared, his face pale. He denied all charges. But reporters had the recording. Words could no longer save him. The next morning, Layla Monroe was summoned to court, not to continue her trial, but to hear the verdict after the case was formally dismissed for serious violations of the trial and investigation process. Vivian sat next to her in the packed courtroom. Layla didn't say much, but when she heard the judge announce, "The court officially dismissed all charges against Layla Monroe," she shed only one tear. Vivian squeezed her hand. "No need to say anything more. Justice doesn't always prevail." But today, it wasn't smothered in silence. That evening, Vivian returned to her office, her arm still not fully healed from the accident. But there was a black envelope on her desk. No name, no return address. She opened it. Inside was a short note. "Very good, Attorney Cross. But do you think Rothwell is the ultimate target?" Along with it was an old photo. 3 men in suits shaking hands in front of a military plant. One of them was Rothwell. The other, Vivian didn't recognize. But the third man's face made her freeze. Richard Calloway, the former intelligence advisor, the man who had assisted Carter, the man who was thought to have disappeared 10 years ago, and the man who, according to classified files, is the founder of a secret organization called the Dominion. No one told Vivian Cross that the first victory would make things easier. In fact, she had never believed in the concept of victory. When Layla was released, people celebrated. Social media exploded. The press hailed her as a brave lawyer who dared to stand up to power. Some even called her a digital Angela Davis. But in Vivian's heart, she knew. This was just the tip of a huge black iceberg that was floating beneath the currents of politics and justice. The photo in the envelope was a declaration of war. Calloway, Rothwell, and a third person whose identity is still unknown. Vivian returned to Carter Wynn. The two spent 72 sleepless hours trying to track down the identity of the third person in the photo. A system that tracked defense contracts had been deactivated to coincide with the time the photo was taken. And then Carter found him. Douglas Greaves, former intelligence officer. Now CEO of a technology company that provides surveillance systems to government agencies. A man who keeps a low profile, but has access to all civilian data, from travel habits to medical histories. He was the man who funded Rothwell's first campaign. He was the shadow behind the shadow. And according to classified documents Carter found on an abandoned server, Douglas was the man who wrote the first draft of the Dominion Protocol, a plan to take over the 3 pillars of law, information, and security through political manipulation, control of data, and the destruction of those who oppose him. Vivian knew. This was no longer a lawsuit, no longer a trial. This was a campaign, an operation against the system. She assembled people she could trust. Carter Wynn, a digital security expert and a genius in hiding. Harper Ewell, now a witness in defense, but ready to testify before Congress. Maribel Tran, a journalist who not only reported but also carried a torch into the layers of power. Elias Knox, a former special ops operative who had served in black ops the government denied and owed Vivian his life for a humanitarian aid mission in Syria. She called the group Light Cell, and their first mission, hacking into Dominion's database, gathering evidence of the Greaves-Rothwell-Hale connection to wrongful convictions across 12 states. No formal warrant. No FBI protection. No television news to use as leverage. There is only truth, and a group of people willing to risk everything to bring it to light. Elias and Vivian infiltrate a secret database located in a Pittsburgh tech hub, where confidential files are encrypted and segmented by political risk. They find a file called Operation Silencer. It contains a list of 42 people who have been arrested, convicted, or disappeared after reporting wrongdoing related to defense funding, media censorship, and election manipulation. Layla Monroe is one of them. Vivian looks at the rest of the names. Professors, journalists, judges, security engineers. They all have something in common. They dare to say no to invisible hands. And all of them have been strangled. She knows. If she doesn't go public, the next ones won't just be arrested. They'll be erased from history. Operation Exposed began with a series of raw data articles. No headlines, no embellishments, just the raw truth with original documents attached. Then the characters began to appear. Former government employees, victims' families, even reporters who had been threatened. The more people knew, the more Dominion lost control. Until one night, Dominion's internal data channel was leaked to the public by an anonymous hacker using the handle Candlewatcher. All the data about Operation Silencer, political connections, funding, exposed to the whole country, and in less than 12 hours, the name Douglas Greaves became the focus of international media. The FBI was forced to open an investigation. Congress convened a special hearing. Rothwell announced his temporary retirement from politics. Judith Hale, arrested at a private airport while trying to fly to Switzerland. Dominion was no longer anonymous. And Vivian Cross, Jones, appeared in the hearing in a black suit, standing tall before the nation, opening her testimony with one sentence. "I am not here for revenge. I am here to reclaim the trust that this system has lost." When the hearing ended, Vivian stepped out into the pouring rain that pounded the roof of the Capitol building. She didn't know if she had won, but she knew that, at least this time, the truth would not die in silence. The lesson here is clear. Don't be silent. Don't take injustice for granted. No matter who you are or where you live, the least you can do is speak up. Vivian Cross' actions are proof that one person, one voice, can shake the system. If you feel this story needs to be spread, hit the like button, leave a comment in support of Layla, and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on stories that really matter. Justice doesn't exist on its own. It needs people like you.